Hello and welcome back to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, where I finish off talking about all the stuff I was going to talk about earlier. Didn't get around to it because there's so much to discuss. Anyway, let's start with a bit of Russian propaganda. This is Julia Davis doing the work she always does so well, which is translating Russian state TV, doing the dirty work so we don't have to. And my goodness, what a torrid job that is with the just the bile that is spouted. And here we have, well, she says, meanwhile on Russian TV, State Duma member, so that's the Russian parliament, Andrei Gurylyov, former deputy commander of Russia's southern military district, argues that striking America with nuclear weapons is the only way forward because Russia brings peace and calm everywhere it goes. Like, I shouldn't be laughing. This is really, really serious. But so let's see what he has to say. Again, I will read it out because there will be many who are listening to this as opposed to watching it.
Американская любовь признает только один.
So you have several people speaking throughout this. At the moment, it's Margarita Simonyan, who has some pretty despicable views. She says Americans know only one type of physical love. It's called BDSM. This has become a bit of a meme. I mean, gee whiz. I don't know if it's allowed to say, if I'm allowed to say that here. And then Solovyov, Vladimir Solovyov, sorry, who is ubiquitous in these programs, says, over here you can say any words. Really? Can you say that this is a war? Can you say you're involved in a war? I don't think you can say any words over there because of censorship. So anyone that's attacking me for like what my claims about freedom of speech, because they didn't quite understand what I've been saying actually, quite often. Hey, take a look at Russia. So anyway, she continues. This is the only way America knows. Only sadism, only tying up and gagging. Go ahead and suffer through it, so to speak. When I'm being told, yeah, so like goodness knows what she's what she's talking about there. Anyway, some other guy. This is the Duma representative. So he says, when I'm being told, and this is Gurylyov, you are a militarist. What in the world are you saying? I'm more than certain that until these friends get hit with a nuke on their skull, they won't come to their senses. So in other words, America won't come to their senses until they're hit with a nuke. We have brought up this topic before, he continues. There is no other way of talking to these fools. Some are trying to convince me that it isn't so. I was on another program on this channel and I said, do you understand what a 152mm nuclear shell is? No. Do you know what its zone of destruction is? How far it can spread because of the wind? What is an air and surface burst? When I ask our colleagues about this, they say, we don't know. And I say, then why? So he says, sorry. And I say, then why are we even discussing this if you don't understand a thing about it? Today, considering our strategic initiative. So just going to pause here. He's just been talking about using nuclear weaponry and he's saying, you don't even understand it. So anyway, I'm going to talk about it. I know what I'm talking about. So he appears to be openly advocating the use of nuclear missiles to impact the skull of America, right? Anyway, what he then goes on to say completely contradicts this. So today, considering our strategic initiative, and right now we have it for sure, along with our current successes. Okay, sorry to pause again. He is claiming that Russia have strategic successes and initiative. I guess Bakhmut, if you want to call that a success, like taking a minuscule amount of land for a huge human and human cost. If you want to talk about Vuhledar being a huge success, I don't know, go for it. But maybe you need to, I don't know, check out what's going on the front lines. I very much want for us to envision the future, he continues. We should make plans beyond the horizon so that we know what happens in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And harshly move towards it in this paradigm. We will win 100%. Where? Everywhere. Everywhere. And this is by far not about Ukraine. Everywhere. Russia was, is, and will be a great nation, capable of bringing peace. Peace is the key word. We bring peace and calm, but we have to draw the conclusion that we didn't take it far enough in 1945. Today, we have to keep pushing to make sure there is no danger and trouble for our country ever again. Yeah, so that's how you bring peace and calm, is you basically attack America with a nuclear missile so it hits their skull and they come to their senses. That's how to do peace and calm, everybody. Always go nuclear. Well done. No. Right, not particularly to do with, I guess, Ukraine per se, but it's an interesting comment that's come from a US general warning that the British army no longer is the top level fighting force. Rishi Sunak risks failing in his role as wartime prime minister unless he takes urgent action given the growing security threat posed by Vladimir Putin. It has been warned with calls for a significant hike in spending. This is coming from Sky News. A senior US general has privately told Defense Secretary Ben Wallace the British Army is no longer regarded as a top-level fighting force, defense sources have revealed. So when you've got Poland now seeking to spend 4% of their GDP on their armed forces, and we are just around 2%, and David Cameron, I remember, to try and toe the NATO party line for spending 2% of GDP on the defences, just moved the money for paying pensions, war pensions. He moved that in from out of the spending on defence to in the spending on defence. It's like, that's not really spending on defence, that's spending on welfare pensions. Yes, they were in the armed forces, but he did that, and that apparently, I seem to remember, I mean, this is going back 10 years maybe, but that pushed us from just below 2% to around 2% or something like that, and it was all a bit controversial at the time. Anyway, we have understandably been in peacetime recently and been thinking about spending stuff on other things. So we have not been spending on the armed forces. You might think I am, but I'm not a war hawk. And actually, I would have been advocating not spending money on the armed forces. And I guess it's a case of analysing where global society, where we are going now, and what our needs are as a nation, and who the threats are, and what those threats will look like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Is China a serious threat to global security? Is Russia going to be a continued threat? What does that say about our military needs, and how do we best spend our money, having to balance spending money on things like a growing aging population that's going to need, and we already spend a massive amount on welfare. Are we going to having to spend that much on welfare given an aging population? What does that say about our ability to spend money on the military? This is from 2016. I only use a 2016 one because it's quite interesting. I'll try and find one that's more recent, because people complained about how much we were spending on the EU and money going to the EU, and it was like, actually, it's a tiny sliver. It's literally, that's the sliver we were spending to the EU. Spending 4%, this is not of GDP, this is 4% of budget on defence there. Pensions here, allowances and relief, health system, and specific non-unemployment benefits. Education, so all these things. So defense is 4%. America will look probably quite different, because they spend apparently the same on defense as the next 70 countries combined. So there's a massive difference between what we spend on defense and what other countries spend. But of GDP, it looks like other countries are way ahead of us and are seeking to continue to be way ahead of us. Poland spending 4% of GDP, being much more than we will be spending. Just going to this source. Now, this is a pie chart for the financial year 2023. We've got 6%, so spending details broken down. So it's now 6% spent on defence, 10% on education, healthcare 20%, pension 17%, interest 8%, so on and so forth. So I mean, that's welfare 13%. So we can see that in 6 years our spending has gone up 2% of our budget on defence. But this article is saying that's not enough by a long shot. The decline in warfighting capability following decades of cuts to save money needed to be reversed faster. than planned in the wake of Russia's war in Ukraine. Quote, bottom line, it's an entire service unable to protect the UK and our allies for a decade, one of the defence sources said. The sources said Rishi Sunak risked failing in his role as a wartime prime minister unless he took urgent action given the growing security threat posed by Russia. This should include increasing the defence budget by at least £3 billion a year, halting a plan to shrink the size of the army even further, and easing peacetime procurement rules that obstruct the UK's ability to buy weapons and ammunition at speed. Quote, we have a wartime Prime Minister and a wartime Chancellor, one source said. History will look back at the choices they make in the coming weeks as fundamental to whether the government genuinely believes that its primary duty is the defence of the realm, or whether that is just a slogan to be given lip service. You are going to have people fighting different corners. You're going to have the Education Secretary saying, are we a nation of educating our young children, not of this? So, it isn't just so easy as saying, yeah, let's spend more money on defence, because that money has to come from somewhere. You're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and in the time of like growing recession pressures, this is difficult. You've also had, and this is something else, the Navy and the Air Force being attacked by the army in the UK, because the army is saying, hey, we're doing all the legwork here for supporting Ukraine. What are you guys doing? And of course, it's coming out of all the army budget. So apparently, it's understood that the armed forces would run out of ammunition, this is UK armed forces, in a few days if called upon to fight. So when we're giving ammunition to Ukraine at the moment, the UK is generally buying it from other places. We're not providing it from our own stocks because we don't have stocks. The UK lacks the ability to defend its skies against the level of missile and drone strikes that Ukraine is enduring. It would take 5 to 10 years for the army to be able to field a warfighting division of some 25 to 30,000 troops backed by tanks, artillery and helicopters. Some 30% of UK forces on high readiness are reservists who are unable to mobilise within NATO timelines, so we'd turn up under strength. The majority of the army's fleet of armoured vehicles, including tanks, was built between 30 to 60 years ago, and full replacements are not due for years. So on and so forth. So it's really interesting when we are talking about supporting Ukraine in the way we are in the UK, and then we look at our own armed forces and say, well, actually, we would fare worse if Russia attacked us. We would have been spanked. Like, okay, we're in Article 5 of the NATO is our cushion, right? And it's everyone's safety cushion. It's strength in numbers. So it's a very different case than Ukraine being attacked. But, on our own, we'd be in trouble. Okay, let's talk about something completely different. You guys not from the UK would have found that distinctly uninteresting, perhaps. Slovenian donated M55S tanks in Ukrainian service, already sporting a fair amount of additional armour, including additional contact ERA. So these are the explosive reactive armour. These form an explosion. They've got like explosives in there, so when a projectile hits it, it explodes outwards and protects. It sounds counterintuitive, really. It protects the armor from being penetrated by exploding the other way onto, the projectile. There are some projectiles that have a double explosion, so they have a first part that explodes ERA and a second part that penetrates to try and get around that, and that's bolted onto the lower front plate. Let's just have a quick look at the M55s. These have been given to Ukraine from Slovenia. Slovenia? Yes, Slovenia. And this is based on the T55. T55 is an old tank, 1947 to present, but it is the most widely used tank in the world, the T55. Has been in service in over 50 countries. And look at the current operators, right? And then the different models and variants. And you'll understand that, wow, this tank has been around a long time. It's in a lot of countries and it has been modified in many, many ways. And we're going to go down to Slovenian modification, which is all the way down here. And it goes on and on, well, not that much further on, but Slovenia is near the end of the alphabet. But you get the idea. The T55, wow. But it is not a modern tank. But the modernisation is quite important. It was done in the late 90s by an Israeli company, as well as Storavne Slovenia. Slovenia modernised 30 of these. The last T-55 was modernised in 1999. The original 100mm tank gun was replaced by a NATO 105mm with a thermal sleeve. Armour protection of the tank was improved considerably. ERA blocks, digital ballistic computer was installed to improve the fire control system. The gunner has 2-axis stabilised day and night sight with an integral laser rangefinder. In addition, the integral optics sight, the commander has the sight with an independent line of sight stabilization, which allows him to acquire targets and lay the gun independently if required. The driver is a combined day-night observation periscope, laser illumination warning receiver, so on and so forth. Just the engine basically entirely upgraded to the point where it is a different kettle of fish than the original, and that's what the M55 kind of looks like. Might not look as cool and black as that now. Probably a little bit more rusted as it's been on the front line with the Ukrainians here, covered in dirt and grime. But you know, a useful tank given. So we heard an analysis I played, some of you might remember from a few weeks back, saying, well, actually, you start putting decent optics in an old tank, and that old tank will have an advantage over newer tanks that don't have the optics. In other words, it's not just about the age of the tank, it's not just about the gun, but it's about who gets to fire first, right? And if you have optics, so whether this be fighting against like another tank or troops who are on the ground with ATGMs, right, anti-tank guided missile launchers. If you have got thermal optics and they don't have thermal optics, and you can see them from some kilometers away, hiding in the undergrowth, and you've got that on your thermal imagery, you're like, right, they're over there because I can see the heat signal. You hit them with fire before they can hit you. You've got that advantage. You may be in an old T-55 type tank, M55S here, but if you've got all those upgraded sort of digital laser, thermal optics, all that kind of stuff, then you are at an advantage, and you can be at an advantage in much more recent tanks that don't have that stuff in it. So there you go. Okay. In December 2022, Zelensky proclaimed, "We will restore the normality of life in the territory of Donbass and Crimea, which were illegally occupied in 2014 and have been brought to the point of disaster. How might Ukraine retake Crimea?" says Mick Ryan, or asks Mick Ryan, who's a former general and Australian general, well worth following on Twitter. I often dip into his thoughts. So, with all the speculation about the potential locations and objectives of the forthcoming Russian and Ukrainian offensives in 2023, there is one strategic objective that may be the culminating point of this war, Crimea. Whether it is a major military campaign on the ground, a Ukrainian long-range strike campaign to make Crimea untenable for Russia, or a forced negotiation, Crimea may be this war's last campaign. But before examining the how of such a campaign, why might Ukraine conduct it? And I talked about this, off my own back the other day. Oops, that's not what I wanted to go to. That's what I want to go to. I was talking about this the other day because there was talk about if you gave Ukraine long-range weaponry, so ranged ordnance missiles that could take out any place on Crimea, then suddenly Crimea is very, very vulnerable. So if you've got, say, ATACMS and you've got an absolutely, you've got an absolute shed load of ATACMS that you can suddenly place in HIMARS and send from all over this sort of region, flood the air defense systems, you could take out these key installations and this place becomes untenable. You take out the Kerch, you take out these railway places, you take out Zhankai air base, you take out the naval base in Sevastopol, you start throwing ATACMS willy-nilly at Crimea, you've got a problem. And that, if Russia then has to pull out of Crimea, then really the point of this war is over, because yeah, they may be talking about the Donbass, but the Donbass is just a way of accessing Crimea from a land bridge, right? So they want the Donbass so that they can have this area, and they want this area so they can get to Crimea. What they want to be able to do is do this, and then use Crimea as a naval base and a port to be able to do trade with the rest of the world, right? This is they want that decent port in Sevastopol. The other ports they have aren't as deep down here and aren't as useful for some reason. Sevastopol is Crimea is a jewel in the crown for the Russians. So to return to Ryan, First, politics. President Zelensky has repeatedly included Crimea in the territory that he wants liberated. It's one of his core war termination aims. Things may be difficult for Zelensky if the war to end with Crimea is still in Russia was to end with Crimea still in the Russian hands. Second, Crimea is part of Ukraine. It became part of Ukraine in 1991 after a national referendum in which a majority of Crimean residents voted for independence from the Soviet Union. It is recognized as part of the Ukraine by the majority of nations in the United Nations. Third, Russian retention of Crimea would present an ongoing military threat to Ukraine. If Russia was to retain Crimea as part of some future negotiation, I'm not advocating this, it would pose a significant and ongoing threat to Ukraine. As Clausewitz, who's a military theorist, tells us, in war, the result is never final. The defeated state often considers the outcome merely as a transitory evil for which a remedy may be found in political conditions at some later date. This is the idea that if you don't completely destroy a country, that they are working out ways that they can get their revenge and reverse the situation. There's lots of theories about World War One going to World War Two. Well, if Germany had been completely taken out of the picture at the end of World War One, then World War Two never would have happened. So it's a kind of Machiavellian approach, isn't it? I think it's Machiavelli said, you either. In fact, I might go and look for that quote. Here it is. He actually has several similar ones. Men ought either to be indulged or utterly destroyed. For if you merely offend them, they take vengeance. But if you injure them greatly, they are unable to retaliate. So that the injury done to a man ought to be such that vengeance cannot be feared. Absolutely. And very similarly, men should either be treated generously or destroyed because they take revenge for slight injuries. For heavy ones, they cannot. So on and so forth. So either pamper or destroy them. So that's the point there. Just to return to Mick Ryan. So first, there are sound reasons for thinking that a military conquest of Crimea will be very difficult and require significant land, sea, and air forces. The terrain hardly assists the attacker. There are two narrow land approaches, and both are likely to be heavily fortified. A second reason is Putin's view of Crimea, as Liana Fix and Michael Kimmage have written, quote, Putin surely regards losing Crimea and surviving as president as irreconcilable. He will go to great lengths to hold on to Crimea. As such, Putin could decide, despite his recent ratcheting down of nuclear rhetoric, that his only option to defend Crimea is nuclear weapons. A recent discussion on Michael Kaufman's podcast, The Russia Contingency, explores this issue in detail, and he sort of refers back to that there. Finally, some propose that a Ukrainian conquest of Crimea might split European support. In the 2022 article, Boris Johnson proposed that a return of Crimea to Ukraine was fraught with risk, but European and American concerns about Crimea have gradually, if not fully, abated. In June 2022, it was reported that France sought a full military victory for Ukraine, including the return of Crimea. An early 2023 report notes that the US president is prepared to arm Ukraine to recapture Crimea. So there are strategic advantages and disadvantages for a Ukrainian campaign to recapture its Crimean territory, and both sides are entrenched with their positions on retention or return of Ukraine. What might be the precursors to a military campaign? The first element of preparation is Western industry stepping up their production of munitions and the transfer of armoured vehicles and other offensive capability to Ukraine. So the idea is more, as you can well imagine. And there's going to be a lot to be said about, as he's already mentioned, Ryan, the idea that if you are going to have a land attack on Crimea, it's not just going to be a case of hitting it with long-range missiles. Then you're going to have to get over these very narrow bridges where you've only really got two of them, two ways into Ukraine, other than using the sea, but Ukraine are lacking in the ability to attack by sea, particularly. So it's going to be quite a tall order. He continues, a second precursor to any Ukrainian move to retake its Crimean territory is the recapture of all of its southern territory. The liberation of Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces will be the operational and tactical foundations for any key campaign in Crimea. In other words, you can't just waltz into Crimea without already having firm control over Kherson here and Zaporizhia here. Without that, your attacks are, you can be cut off really, really easily. So it's dangerous without having firm control of those two. And of course, that's a massive ask. A third enabler will be influence operations to ensure that the population of Crimea understand that the Ukrainian move to retake its territory will not result in discrimination against them in the aftermath. Finally, strategic patience, although Putin reputedly told the Israeli Prime Minister earlier this year, "We are a big country and we have patience." The West is surprising Putin by showing resilience and ongoing support for Ukraine. This has to continue probably into 2024. We're in for the long haul, right? All of these are necessary precursors to Ukraine considering a large military campaign to seize Crimea. There are two broad options for a Ukrainian conquest of Crimea. First, Ukraine could undertake a large-scale air, sea and land operation to advance on several axes against key land objectives in Crimea. A robust air and sea campaign would be needed to accompany the 100,000 or so Ukrainian troops required to recapture Crimea. A second option would be for Ukraine to capture the entirety of its southern provinces of Kherson and Zaporizhia and hold fast, forming a land blockade and fire support base. Ukraine could hold Crimea at risk of large-scale missile and drone attacks. These are not mutually exclusive options. Both are saleable and have multiple variations and branch plans. Knowing how bloody an invasion would be, planners would also phase their campaign to attempt the latter first before launching a large-scale operation to retake Crimea. If Ukraine was in a position to undertake either of these two options, there could be an opportunity for negotiations about the future of Crimea. Russia would be in a difficult position if it holds out on negotiations, and of course, it may still consider the nuclear option. At some point, if Ukrainians are able to sustain the momentum generated at the end of 2022 and retain the initiative on the battlefield, they may find themselves on the cusp of military operations to seize back Crimea. And the important takeaway there is that if they are serious about Crimea, they have to have Kherson and Zaporizhia. So it's not. So you can't just treat Crimea on its own in isolation. It's got to be part of a much larger offensive, and to take all of those regions will take hundreds of thousands of troops, arguably, and so that is no mean feat. So you might think, okay, it's going to be about maybe this kind of march down, maybe including Melitopol, maybe not, march down to the sea, to the coast, and splitting the land bridge. Yeah, okay, how long would that take? Are we talking months for that to happen? It's not going to be the lightning. The amount of defences, you are not going to see another Kharkiv. That is not going to happen in this war at all, I don't think. The defences are there, the numbers of people are there, if not like brilliant mechanization and whatnot. But that would take a long time, and then you wouldn't want it too thin for fear of being, cut off. So it might look, you might want it more like that, and then, then where do you go? What are your options? Because that has to become, then you need to get down to the coast, and then you're thinking, well, really, then if Crimea is an option, then you need all of that. And this flank needs to be really secure wherever you have that set, because that needs to be protected and become a buffer for an attack into Crimea. But then you need, as he says, a good 100,000 troops to take Crimea. And this is the problem with Russia at the beginning of the war, is they tried to take the whole of Ukraine with a couple of 100,000 soldiers. Well, once they found out that Ukraine didn't want them there, it turned from a special military operation to get rid of the government to suddenly now being sort of all involved around here and not having nearly enough troops to take the entire nation, where you'd need, I don't know, 1 million troops. It's just, yeah, so that's what happened there. Okay, moving on. Poland can hand over its F-16 fighter jets if Ukraine is such a decision to Ukraine. Sorry, if a decision is supported by NATO. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said at a press conference. So Poland really are the best mates of Ukraine at the moment. They are going above and beyond. They are really doing everything they can to support Ukraine. As it was a few months ago in the context of MiGs, so any other air power will be implemented and possibly transferred in agreement with NATO countries. Here we will act in full coordination. Okay, so we may see some movement, but it's probably going to have to be coordinated by NATO, not just a case of Poland giving over a bunch of airplanes. With the help of Canadian instructors, Ukrainian soldiers are being trained in the UK on the usage of night vision devices. The reason I've included this as something to say is that Ukraine need to get every single advantage they can over the Russians, so that in every sphere of warfare they don't have the troops, right? They don't have the number of troops, but if they can get advantages in any other way, then that gives them the competitive advantage to get an asymmetry in terms of outcome. Like if they're going to battle on the front line in Bakhmut, if all the Ukrainian soldiers had night vision and were trained on them and had that equipment and could fight at night, and the Russians couldn't, then suddenly you could see a changing of momentum there. So every little advantage needs to be eked out and maximalized, optimized. Um, and here is just a great example. Okay, night vision, let's give you all this kit and let's train you up on it and let's send you back and let's see you using it on the front line. Now, one of the problems with the whole idea of corruption is that apparently you have seen, as we're giving all this great equipment, body armor, helmets, and all this stuff, you are seeing people on the western, so you're seeing all these sort of border guards and soldiers in the Lviv area and near Poland being absolutely amazingly equipped. And then as that equipment is transported, and I talked about this with the Russians at the beginning of the war, the same thing was happening with the Russians. As you're getting closer to the front line, the troops have less and less decent equipment. And although I've said that they have better equipment than the Russians are suffering with this problem as well, because they're I'll talk to you about that in a minute. So the interview with EOAM was saying this, but lots of people have been saying this. That I was listening to someone else talk about this on the Ukraine the Latest podcast, saying that he has seen, one of the reporters was saying he has seen that troops, the further west you go, the better the equipment they have. Now, with the Russians, apparently towards the beginning of the war, you had these supply trucks that were turning up, and they'd be unloaded back here to be put somewhere else and put on another truck, or unloaded from a train to put on a truck. And as that was happening, people back here would be helping themselves to stuff, and they'd be taking the best cigarettes or the best this, the best that. And then as the further forward it went, you end up having, out of a whole truck, you'd only have like two crates left on the whole truck at the front. So the guys at the front who needed the stuff the most were not getting it. These guys were not only taking it near further back, but they were then reselling it to the guys on the front. So it was getting to them, but they had to then pay for it. They had to pay effectively bribery or black market money to get the stuff that they were originally being sent anyway. Just that's the level of corruption that was apparently going on then at that point. Right. Last thing I'm going to talk to you about is this question. So Iran has been hit, and we don't know whether these were Israeli drones taking out the Iranians, maybe Shahed factories, maybe missile factories. Was it on behalf of Ukraine, or was it irrespective of Ukraine? I don't know. I don't even know who did it. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, because there's a philosophical question coming out of this, which is, let's assume that Israel did that, right? And again, don't hold me to that. I'm just for the point of argument. Okay. Leah, who's brilliant, thank you so much for your support, says, just on the critical side, it may be morally good that Iranian factories are being bombed, but is there an international legal basis for such an action? Not a remark, but a real question. It's a great question, and I was wondering exactly this myself. So I was thinking, this is brilliant, but actually, is it right? Well, I would say it is right, but that doesn't. Something being morally right doesn't mean it fits in line with international law on warfare, because it depends from which position you're looking from and what your consequences are and what your moral value system is and how you apply that. So these things get really complicated. Anyway, it's kind of like a preemptive war, preemptive strike. So a preemptive war is a war that's commenced in an attempt to repel or defeat a perceived imminent offensive or of invasion, or to gain a strategic advantage in an impending, allegedly unavoidable war shortly before that attack materializes. It is a war that preemptively breaks a peace, okay? And it can be, it's different from a preventative war, so that the difference is that a preventative war is launched to destroy the potential threat of the targeted party when an attack by that party is not imminent or known to be planned. So this in Iran is possibly more of a preventative war than a preemptive war. So a preemptive war is launched in anticipation of immediate aggression by another party. It depends, whoever did this, it depends what their thoughts were and what their predictions of what Iran was going to do. If they thought Iran was genuinely about to attack, then it's a kind of preemptive war. And the legality of that is, and I'll come back to preventive war in a second. So it's generally considered, Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter is generally considered to be the jus cogens, a compelling law, but in practice higher international law, and prohibits all UN members from exercising, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of political independence of any state. However, in the modern framework of the UN Charter, it is the phrase armed attack occurs in Article 51 that draws the line between legitimate and illegitimate military force. Some scholars believe it is reasonable to assume that if no armed attack has yet occurred, that no automatic justification for preemptive self-defense has yet been made legal under the UN Charter. So no matter how you cut it, some people say it's illegal. In order to be justified as an act of self-defense, two conditions must be fulfilled, which are widely regarded as necessary for its justification. The first of these is that actor must have believed that the threat is real. Well, they can claim that, right? As opposed to merely perceived. The second condition is that the force used in self-defense must be proportional to the harm which the actor is threatened. Okay, so if they're blowing up a factory that is making cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and if they're blowing up a factory that's making drones, then that, to me, that is proportional. That would be proportional. Do they believe that this is genuinely in self-defense? Well, if it's Israel, do they actually believe that these weapons are going to be used against Israel? And that's where it gets a little bit funky, because I don't think that can be maintained. So a preventative war is a war or a military action which is initiated in order to prevent a belligerent or a neutral party from acquiring a capability for attacking. The party which is being attacked has a latent threat capability, or it has shown that it intends to attack in the future based on its past actions and posturing. A preventative war aims to forestall a shift in the balance of power by strategically attacking before the balance of power has had a chance to shift in the favour of the targeted party. Preventative war is distinct from preemptive strike, which is a first strike when an attack is imminent. And the argument here is, well, does it look like an attack from Iran is imminent? Probably not. In which case, this looks like a preventative war. Most experts hold that a preventative war undertaken without the approval of the United Nations is illegal under the modern framework of international law. In other words, it's probably the case that this is illegal. However, that doesn't mean it's not right, and that is your difference. There are lots of ways of looking at this. If I put it in really simplistic terms, imagine a big bully is beating up a less able person on the road, right? Or I don't know, in a playground, or we could put it school playground, right? Bully is beating up this other kid, right? And he's beating him up with this baseball bat. And when the baseball bat gets a bit of blood on it and he needs to change it, there's another kid. Let's call him Vlad. Oh no, let's call him Ian, because it sounds a bit like Iran. Ian is giving Vlad these baseball bats. He just keeps handing him these baseball bats, and Vlad's going, "Thank you very much," and hitting this poor kid with these baseball bats. And Ian, in fact, has been making these baseball bats himself, and he's handing them over. Maybe he's been sharpening them as well, and he's stabbing this poor kid with these like bits of wood that Ian has been sharpening. Now you're looking over at this, and you're thinking, "Hang on, I can see what's going on here." Now, if you see that what Vlad is doing is morally wrong, then what Ian is doing in giving Vlad this stuff is also morally wrong. So, irrespective of what international law says, I would say in that kind of really simplistic situation, it would be right for me to walk up and smack Ian's arm down and stop him from handing over those sharpened stakes or baseball bats. In fact, I'm going to break those stakes so that they can't be given to Vlad to stab or hit this poor guy, whatever his name is, Ukraine. I couldn't think of a name, but because of you, what a silly letter. So you've got Ian supplying Vlad with stuff to attack Ukraine, I should be able to hit Ian's arm away, and I should be able to break those stakes, and that is a morally right thing to do. Like, I think personally, me, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, I think that's morally right. You start laying that onto the international geopolitics, and things get really confusing and a lot more complex. But perhaps they ought not to. I mean, in international law, that is technically illegal, so no one admits to who did it. But it's probably the right thing to do. These are weapons of destruction being used to harm an ally, a sovereign nation, and also civilians. These are directly harming civilians. And this is a very interesting philosophical conundrum, and actually an international legal conundrum. And an interesting way of maybe differentiating between international law, which is made to try the very sort of digital or binary kind of approaches to very complex situations, and quite often they are rules of thumb. They don't necessarily work in every situation. So it could be that international law says one thing, but common decent moral sense and evaluation says another thing here. But I'd be interested to see what you say. I'm no expert on international law and the legality of such things, and I would need to know more details about exactly what has happened here. But I can see justification for this happening, for this taking place. Anyway, there you go. That's another very long video. Thank you for indulging me. This may have to go out the next day, because this is 2 very long videos of Ukraine War Update Extra. Thanks for all your support. Please take care. There are all the ways you can support the channel in the description below. Please take care, and I will speak to you tomorrow.